Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Communicative Leader. I'm your host, Dr. Leah O, and today we're diving into the critical topic of workplace justice, and we're doing so with the true advocate, Taylor Crabill. As a dedicated attorney specializing in employment law, Taylor's committed to supporting and advocating the rights of employees, those who have faced discrimination, retaliation, wage issues, you name it. With a practice built on integrity and resilience, he's taken on some of the largest companies, ensuring that those who've been wronged by their employers are not silenced, but rather empowered. In today's episode, we'll explore Taylor's journey as an advocate for workplace justice. We're going to discuss the vital role of communication in navigating legal challenges and shine a light on how individuals can champion their own rights. Taylor's unwavering pursuit of justice not only emphasizes the importance of fair treatment in the workplace, but also inspires us to stand up against unlawful conduct. Whether you're an employee seeking to understand your rights or a leader looking to foster a more just work environment, this conversation will equip you with the tools and insights to advocate for fairness and integrity in your workplace. Let's dive in and have some fun. Hello, and welcome to The Communicative Leader, hosted by me, Dr. Leah O'Million-Hodges. My friends call me Dr. O. I'm a professor of communication and a leadership communication expert. On The Communicative Leader, we're working to make your work life what you want it to be. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today on The Communicative Leader. I'm really excited to dive into your expertise and learn more about employment law. And I was hoping before we do that you could share some of your journey to becoming an advocate for employees who are facing discrimination or other unfair treatment in the workplace.
Yeah, sure, Leah. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on. So yeah, I've dedicated my career and will continue to do so to employment law. I got my start in employment law out of college when I joined an employment side law firm in New York City that represents employees. So I worked there as a paralegal for 2 years and was able to get an understanding of the sorts of employment law situations out there. And the most rewarding part of that was getting to see when cases would settle, when they would resolve, and the client we were representing sort of had a huge weight lifted off his or her shoulders and was able to put this very negative, dark time in their life behind them. And move on, focus on their career and their family. So that's how I first got introduced to it. Went to law school, tried a couple of different things to make sure I knew what I wanted to do. Kept coming back to employment law, and here we are today.
That is awesome, and thank you for what you do. I mean, being an employee is really hard.
Absolutely.
Like it's hard under the best case scenario. And then I'm sure you see a lot of, not so best case scenarios.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's, we're human, and it's an unfortunate reality that we do live with, discrimination and other unlawful conduct. But you can inform yourself and make sure that you understand the protections that you have under the law. And you can have an advocate on your side, right? Even if you decide not to move forward with legal action, just giving an attorney a call to understand what the law is.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, do I have a case here? What's the potential value of that case? Any other sort of questions you may have. And ultimately, you make the decision about whether you want to move forward. So it can't hurt to get the information that you need. And as long as you're making an informed decision, then you're doing what's right for you.
Yeah. And I love that, giving employees more agency in that way too, and letting them drive, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Taylor, I want to think about some common issues. And when I was getting ready for our conversation, I was wondering, what in your practice, what do you see in terms of maybe discrimination, retaliation, wage disputes, anything else that's very common? And then kind of a second part, are there things that our titled leaders out there can proactively do to either make sure these things don't arise, or if they do realize, oops, right, there's an issue here, how do they prevent escalation?
Yeah, so the first part was what can employees do? Just remind me of that.
But yeah, what are the common issues, the most common issues that you see?
So there's different types of discrimination, right? The laws protect against race discrimination, gender, age, disability. So there, all those sorts of cases exist out there. You mentioned retaliation, and maybe that's not something that most people are familiar with unless you're dealing with it.
Yeah.
But in addition to obviously not being allowed to discriminate against people in the workplace, you can't retaliate against them in certain circumstances, right? So when someone is experiencing, let's say, sexual harassment in the workplace, and the employee goes to complain about it and makes a complaint in a specific way, hi HR, hey supervisor, someone else at the company who can address this situation. I feel like I'm being sexually harassed. This is kind of what, listing out what I've been dealing with in email. What can we do to address this? More likely than not, something similar to that is going to be what's considered a quote unquote protected activity under the law. And so if the employer responds negatively to it, we don't want this squeaky wheel here. We don't want to deal with someone complaining. Yep. We just want to make some money. We'll see you later, right? Sometimes, or most of the time, it ends in a termination because you've made that protected complaint, because you've, and hopefully in writing, explained that you feel like you're being discriminated against, you're experiencing sexual harassment. Now you have additional protection that if you hadn't done that, you likely wouldn't have under the law.
Yeah, that's really good to know. And then the second part of that, I'm wondering, our title leaders or managers, directors, how do they proactively address these issues and also prevent escalation if then they see something is going on? What happens next from a title leader position? What should happen next, I guess?
Yeah, and being in that sort of leader or managerial role, it's not easy, right? You obviously have maybe certain primary functions related to the company's services. Obviously, you're managing a team of a certain size. You're probably expected to hit some sort of metrics or targets in order to demonstrate the value you're bringing to the company. So it's not easy. You're dealing with those things, and then on top of that, invariably, you likely will encounter something related to employment law at some point during your career. Right? And it's important to understand what the company's procedures are related to employment law, whether that's reviewing a handbook, speaking to HR, speaking to inside counsel if there is an internal attorney, or maybe having to speak to outside counsel if that's necessary as well. Making sure that you have the full information about what you should do in response to a complaint. If someone comes to you and says, hey, I feel like I'm being sexually harassed, and maybe subjectively you may not think the conduct was so terrible, or maybe this, I don't know that this rises to something that's a problem. Err on the side of caution, right? And make sure you're following the procedures and reporting things. You give your employer the opportunity to address something if something needs to be addressed. So taking everything seriously and making sure that you understand the company's procedures and that you are not afraid to reach out to the professionals in that field.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I think that's something that in the work I do as an organizational scholar, working with leaders, a lot of it is a lot of fear associated with that, and recognizing that it's just kind of an awareness and knowledge is power approach is oftentimes what's going to set them up to be most successful.
Sure.
Excellent. So now, Taylor, I'm wondering if you could let employees across America know a few things. What are some key aspects of employment law that you wish all employees were aware of so they just were better informed and better able to advocate for themselves?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is being proactive, right? A lot of what happens in employment law is reactive, right? You weren't paid your wages, you contact an attorney, see if you can get your wages that you earned, right? You suffer discrimination in the form of unlawful firing, you contact an attorney to learn, do I have claims here? What can I do? But being proactive can really position yourself to have the most protections possible, right? So, typically a consultation call with an employment attorney should be free, and they should be able to assess your situation and help you to a certain extent, right? I mentioned before those, protected emails, complaints that you can make to HR or to someone, supervisor, or someone that can do something about whatever's going wrong. Working with an attorney to make sure you have the right language, right? If you just complain, hey, Tim down the hall, I really don't like him. We're not getting along. We've butted heads a couple of times, but there's nothing in there about the fact that you believe that the things that he's saying or the way that he's acting is because you're a woman, for example, right? Then without that sort of specific language, then it might not be that protected activity, and you're losing some protection of the law. So, so being proactive in that way and feeling that you can reach out to an attorney, like I mentioned before, you can reach out to an attorney. It's ultimately up to you about whether you want to do something about it, but at least you're informed. The next big thing is that these employment cases, for the most part, not going to have a smoking gun. And what I mean by that, there's no email that says, hey, Jane got pregnant. We need to get rid of her. She's not going to be dedicated to the company anymore. That's, sure. Does it happen from time to time? Yes. Most likely, no. Right.
Yeah.
And so there are going to be other things that you're going to want to look out for, right? If you are disclosing a pregnancy, if you unfortunately suffer from some sort of disability that you need to disclose to your employer, if you are reaching a certain age and you feel like the age is now becoming a factor in your employment, trusting your gut, right? And understanding that, something's not right here and I need to do something about it, or I need to at least understand what I can do about it. So common things you see are, someone discloses that they're pregnant, discloses that their disability, maybe getting up into a certain age, and is like, hey, listen, since those things have happened, since I told you about my pregnancy and my disability, or since, now I'm 50 years old, I've noticed I'm not getting the same sort of jobs, not being put on these high-end projects. I was a great performer, excellent performance reviews prior, but now ever since then, I'm rated a lot lower, and I'm being micromanaged, and I'm seeing people who aren't pregnant or men, not being, being given opportunities or promotions that I feel I should deserve, right? So understand, and another big one is comments, right? In the pregnancy circumstance, how long are you going to be out? It's going to be so tough for us with you not here. Are you really going to be putting in the same amount of time now that you have, childcare responsibilities? Those sort of things should sort of set off a red flag that, hopefully nothing happens. Hopefully everything works out, but I need to know how I'm protected and what I can do if things start to continue to go in a negative way.
Yeah, those are really helpful red flags to look for too. And I think, like you're saying, things that we've kind of societally overlooked and just like, oh, that's part of it, but it shouldn't be part of it.
Yeah, it's so tough because, we all have jobs. No one's perfect. You're going to make mistakes, right? And so, maybe the feeling is, I've made a couple of mistakes, the ship's going to right itself in a couple of weeks. But oftentimes, because it's, because the employer is trying to rely on some other reason other than the fact that you're pregnant, you're disabled, you're getting older, they're going to, try to paper poor performance. And it has to be over weeks or months. So just, again, hopefully nothing goes wrong. Unfortunately, they do sometimes, but trust in your gut and just reaching out to somebody as soon as possible, just so that you understand where you sit and you can get someone on your side to help you out.
Yeah. And this next question, I mean, you've already hinted at this, but I want to think about self-advocacy and the advice that you have for employees, especially in terms of being able to kind of clearly articulate their concerns to management, but also protecting their rights.
Yeah, I mean, obviously educating yourself about the employment laws and what certain things might be considered a protected activity, like the written complaints that we talked about earlier. But self-advocacy has its risks, right? Maybe, like I said, you don't word the email in the correct way, so you don't have those protections under the law against retaliation, or it's harder to prove it, right? Maybe it's more nuanced, like, oh, when I said this, I meant this, and it's less clear than if you had help, likely from an employment attorney to do something like that. There's also, oftentimes audio recordings come into play, right? Someone wants to record a meeting that they're in because they feel that something's going wrong and they want to understand. But depending on where you are in certain states, you can't secretly record, right? You need to let the other person know that you're recording. In other states, completely fine, right? So there's and there's no reason for the average employee to know these sort of things unless you're dealing with it, right? So
exactly.
So in that sort of way, yes, certainly you can do some stuff on your own, but there shouldn't be a hesitancy to reach out to an employment attorney, because reaching out doesn't mean that you are moving forward. It's a private, confidential conversation. Your employer's never going to know that you reached out to an attorney if you don't decide to move forward with legal action. And it's really our job to help employees in these situations. And then if things unfortunately take a turn for the worse, then maybe a more formal representation and doing a lawsuit.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'm wondering too, with self-advocacy, do you recommend, if you say I'm pregnant and there's one comment, don't think anything of it, but then I hear something similar, do you recommend employees just kind of jot this down or document in that way? Like what are your views on kind of abdicating or kind of proactively building protections in just in case?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a good idea, right? Having a record as things are happening so that it's clear in your mind, you're remembering things maybe in more detail, is certainly a good idea. You're going to want to make sure that if you're doing that, whether it's electronically or handwritten notes, that you're labeling them, ideally on each page, for my attorney, anticipation of a lawsuit or anticipation of litigation, because that sends a really clear message that these should be protected, right? If I do decide to sue my employer, these notes weren't for, just for any reason. They're for a specific reason. And the law recognizes that presentations to an attorney, or if you're doing something in anticipation for a lawsuit, that they should be protected, because you should be able to have frank conversations about your legal rights. So again, making sure that you're documenting things in that way. But and again, if you're talking to an employment lawyer, I can tell you how to do that, right? And I can tell you the sort of things that you should be jotting down. So that's a good point, though.
Yeah, and that might be a sign if you're starting to realize you have to document it. That's the sign to reach out.
Yeah, right. I mean, again, it happens so often that it's reacting, right? And there is maybe some optimism that things work out, but I've had situations where I've spoken to people, helped them draft these complaints, and I haven't heard from them again, right? Because I hope everything
was resolved.
And other times we've drafted those things, those sort of complaints, and it's unfortunately led to a termination. And then we talk about what can we do to fix the situation. So yeah.
But I can really see why you need the expert there to assist in these, especially the employee versus an organization. So that's a perfect lead into retaliation. So this is something that in my own research I've seen a lot of, and I know a lot of times it either goes unnoticed or it is so subtle that a lot of times people don't quite know if they have a legitimate concern or complaint. So and thinking about retaliation in organizations, what are some strategies that leaders could employ to start to recognize it and to prevent it within their work groups or teams?
Yeah. So from a leader standpoint, when you get the sort of complaint that we're talking about, again, following the right procedures, taking it seriously, because you want to avoid any sort of action that you're engaging in to be perceived as retaliation, right? maybe you get an email from somebody. I feel like I'm being discriminated against based on, ABC, protected
Mm-hmm.
characteristic, gender, age, disability. These are the examples of why I believe this.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe you decide to take action on your own. Well, okay, I'm going to move you over here, or I'm going to put you on a different team away from this bad person.
Yep.
But perhaps maybe that transfer is could be seen as an act of retaliation. It might seem innocent
Mm-hmm.
on your part, and you might think that you're actually trying to do a good thing, but without sort of consulting with the employer side legal team or HR. You want to avoid those sort of minefields of doing
Mm-hmm.
something that might trigger, whether legitimately or not, potential liability.
Yeah, yep, that's really helpful. And this next question is also leader related. And I know we talked a little bit about kind of the role that leaders can play, but I'm wondering, how would you recommend they ensure that they're being held accountable for keeping a fair workplace? And if you've seen any practices or anything you would suggest that they could implement to ensure that, they're a lot of times we're blind to biases. So, what would that look like? What would you coach a leader on to say these are some best practices to keep a culture of accountability?
Yeah, again, that could be something that you have like a one-on-one conversation with HR
Mm-hmm.
internal, external, professional about. It could also be part of your trainings, right? There are different
Mm-hmm.
trainings that employees do specific to implicit bias, sexual harassment,
Mm-hmm.
other trainings related to the workplace. So making sure that those sort of materials are taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It can be easy. We've all kind of been there, sat in conference rooms or
Mm-hmm.
you know uh, ballrooms, hearing speeches about
Mm-hmm.
certain sorts of things, and maybe you just want to get back to your work. You have other things on your mind, so it can be difficult from, let's say, HR or a trainer standpoint to convey the seriousness of the information. But making sure your training materials do that and
Mm-hmm.
making them relatable, right? You know, maybe some of the examples are a bit corny or, not really relatable. So
Mm-hmm.
relying on real world examples that maybe don't have some sort of connection, like someone might have a reference outside of an employment situation. The recent one that comes to mind is Blake Lively's lawsuit in connection with
Mm-hmm.
her sexual harassment claims
Yep.
on the movie set, right? Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
probably most people understand who Blake Lively is.
Yep.
It's in the news outside of legal world. So
Mm-hmm.
drawing on something, current events that's
Mm-hmm.
happening to shed light on an example, or if you're speaking to your legal team, maybe a recent case that has an interesting set of facts that
Mm-hmm.
you can build into examples. So it's, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
focusing on storytelling in a way
Mm-hmm.
to convey these sort of ideas and the seriousness in them, because people are going to
Mm-hmm.
remember stories more
Yep.
often than they remember, me just reciting what the employment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really helpful. And I think with that, you kind of answered my next question, which was these practical steps leaders could take to create a workplace culture that recognizes rights and supports them. And thinking about the Blake Lively case, I imagine there are a number of individuals on sets that are really rethinking what these interactions might look like. What would be some suggestions you would have for them, just kind of anywhere, or it can be related in the context of the film industry? But what were some things that you would then coach these employers to say, "Hey, I'd like you to be mindful of these things," or "These are some steps you can take to create this environment where everyone feels safe."
Yeah, and again, I think it comes through those sort of trainings. If you're talking about people on set who aren't maybe directly involved in any sort of alleged
Mm-hmm.
unlawful conduct, um, encouraging them to come forward as well. If they're in some sort of manager role, they might have an
Mm-hmm.
obligation to come forward, right?
Yeah.
And taking
Mm-hmm.
that seriously. I think sometimes not everyone that a directed that experiences an insensitive joke or discriminatory joke or comment, or, not
Mm-hmm.
everybody comes forward, and for different
Yep.
reasons, right?
Yeah.
And so it maybe happens in the workplace that, you hear an off-color comment here or there, a joke here or there, and, nothing really happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, maybe this, maybe that adds into the work culture a little bit, but then it might downplay, like, I've seen this before, nothing really happens, it was, whatever, it wasn't too bad.
Mm-hmm.
But again, just taking it seriously, because, maybe an employee is going to decide to stand up, and, and I've thought about it, and I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
take some action to fix what I think was something wrong that happened to me. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe even having that assumption that everyone who experiences that is going to come forward, so
Yep.
that you're treating it with the appropriate level of seriousness that it deserves.
Yeah, I really like that. I like starting with that assumption and being really clear about it as well, so everyone knows what the expectations are.
Yeah, I think it's important to communicate
Mm-hmm.
that, and to reinforce it. Right? We talked about
Mm-hmm.
different trainings. Maybe you do a
Mm-hmm.
implicit bias training once a year.
Yep.
You do a sexual harassment training once a year. Follow up emails, right? Like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
here's, we had this a couple months ago. Here's a
Yep.
little reminder about what we discussed, or, there's different days dedicated to, uh, you know, sexual harassment
Mm-hmm.
awareness, or, certain,
Mm-hmm.
different days like that. Those could be good opportunities to say, hey, a little reminder about what we talked about. So finding ways to sort of follow up and keep people
Mm-hmm.
engaged in the material is also likely to help mitigate these situations.
Yeah, that's so important because you're right. There's so many trainings. It's like, check, it's off my list. I will do that in 365 more days. So, and I like too, then we're reinforcing this workplace where we're saying this is really important to us. This is not just a compliance issue that we are checking off the list. This is something that we take seriously, and you should too.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Very important.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned communication a few times, and I am interested in communication and conflict. And I imagine a lot of your job revolves around trying to resolve
Mhm.
conflicts and finding resolution. And so what are some techniques you'd recommend either for, employees who are in this situation looking to de-escalate something with their leader, or vice versa? If there's a leader who's trying to address a grievance effectively, what are some of the communication strategies you have seen work the best?
Right. So communication, like, let's say you're saying a situation where someone comes and complains about potentially unlawful behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, keeping that dialogue, making sure, you're not dismissing it, allowing the employee the time and space, obviously privately, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
employee feels comfortable, in a situation to
Mm-hmm.
explain what's going on, documenting that, perhaps in a way that you
Yeah.
can share it with
Mm-hmm.
with counsel. Obviously, you're going to want to speak with your own legal team to make sure that you're following the practices that they want you to follow. But yeah, making sure, again, what I spoke earlier about, if there's sort of a change in the employee situation, maybe that becomes something, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is retaliatory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the employee can make out a claim of retaliation. So trying to keep things, continuing as they were, to the extent that you can.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if you're dealing with a situation where it's not possible for two people to work together, making sure you're um, communicating with professionals on how best to do that, because it can be a very difficult thing to have to manage an employee who is pursuing those sort of claims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly. And then for that employee who's pursuing the claims, if things are being or feeling really heated when they're interacting with peers or with their leader, what are some coaching strategies you leave them with so they can communicate effectively, but, it doesn't always feel explosive?
Sure. And the communication, a big part of it is what we talked about in terms of making those complaints,
Hmm.
right? if
Mhm.
you're being criticized and you feel
Mhm.
like it's unfounded, or it's
Mhm.
weird, I wasn't being criticized for this stuff before. Making sure you're pushing back against
Mhm.
those performance issues,
Mhm.
and sort of giving your side. Again, because every person, every situation is different, right? You're going to want to uh, speak to a lawyer so that you're getting
Mhm.
that professional advice tailored to your situation, rather than relying on something more generally. But yeah, making sure that you're communicating clearly what you feel is unlawful,
Mhm.
and then um, like very clearly how you feel the performance critiques of you are
Mhm.
justified.
Yeah, and I think with that, it's probably taking a step back, trying to write the like objective, trying to remove the emotion, um, and not such a reactive response.
Yeah, right. I think that's fair. And that's a really good point, because
Mhm.
these employment situations are very personal, are very
Mhm.
emotional. Oftentimes, employees are putting years of hard work into a company,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden they're let go after, I've decided to start a family, or I've
Mhm.
suffered some sort of injury, or, I'm getting older. Um, and that comes with, if, an unlawful firing, obviously you lose your
Mhm.
compensation.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, so many people live paycheck to paycheck, so that can be an
Mhm.
absolutely devastating thing to happen. Our healthcare system is tied a lot to employment. Most
Yeah.
people get their healthcare through
Mhm.
employment, so you're losing your healthcare and then having to figure that out, which can be very difficult. So yeah, you know. Um, Trying to take yourself out of it, and a good way to do that is to speak to a lawyer, because
Mhm.
they're going to be an advocate for you. They're not personally invested in sort of the dynamics of the situation, personally invested
Yep.
in
Mhm.
achieving the best outcome they can for the client or prospective client. But it's a way to maybe temper very
Mhm.
real and justified feelings that you may be having.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And my two final questions for you, and this is how we end every episode of the Communicative Leader. And there are two questions that are connected. So the first part, this was for our titled leaders, and the second part is employees across all ranks, all industries. Thinking about what is the pragmatic leadership, a communication tip, advice, or challenge that you'd like to leave them with?
Sure. For the leader, in terms of communication, especially in these
Mm-hmm.
employment situations, I would say the communication with your professionals, right? With HR,
Mm-hmm.
with legal professionals. Don't be afraid to have those conversations with
Mm-hmm.
them, even if you feel that the conduct might not be all too serious, or at least that's how you perceive
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone might perceive it differently.
Yeah.
So, while you may have a good understanding, right? You've attended the trainings, you've done the
Mm-hmm.
follow up materials, you've been in this space for a long time, you feel like you've dealt with these situations. Keep those lines of communication open, because
Mm-hmm.
it can be, very easy to take a misstep that leads to a bigger
Yeah.
issue if you're not regularly communicating with HR, or with an attorney at the company. It
Mm-hmm.
can be difficult, right? Because we talked about the other things that you have to do as part of your job, but
Yeah.
um, very important to address those things, keep that communication open so you don't create a bigger problem.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Um,
is really helpful.
yeah, for employees, again, just
Mm-hmm.
the communication with a potential advocate, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I say it all the time. I just can't stress it
Mm-hmm.
enough. Is being
Mm-hmm.
proactive about it, right? If you are experiencing something at work, you might feel like you're alone, right? You might feel,
Mm-hmm.
what can I do? I'm an employee. I'm working
Mm-hmm.
at this, company, nationwide
Mm-hmm.
company with offices all over the place. They have hundreds of, tens of whatever
Mm-hmm.
employees, employment attorneys
Yeah.
inside the company. How am I going to ever stand up to them? And you can.
Mm-hmm.
People do every day.
Mm-hmm.
So while you may, maybe it may feel easy to sort of, put this on the shelf. Hopefully it doesn't become any worse. Keeping that idea of communicating with a professional, because it really is or really should be a sort of no risk and free and private conversation.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. I think especially, in our society when we're so largely defined by what we do, that is a huge part of how we present to others and how we get to know others. That if that isn't going well and you feel isolated, I mean, that's a really hard place to be. So I love that idea, and two, acknowledging that the initial consult should be free. So
Yeah,
I really like that.
some attorneys may charge for it, but do your homework, right? There's
Yep.
no, like anything else, right? You're going to read reviews,
Mm.
you're going to talk
Yep.
to multiple law firms, you're going to speak to multiple lawyers. You'll hopefully get a sense of, oh, okay, this person did a 30+ minute call with me, all the details down, requested documents. We're having a follow-up call to talk about things in more detail. Other than maybe something shorter than that, right? So it's important to reach out to someone, but then reaching out to someone who's going to be invested in your situation as well.
Yeah, and thank you for the work that you do. I left industry to do this PhD for research to hopefully make people's work lives a little bit easier and feeling like they have some agency. And it's so nice to know there are a lot of protections out there for them.
Yeah, certainly are. And I guess, we're all in this fight together, and hopefully we are making progress. I think slowly but surely, but we'll keep the fight going.
Yes. Well, thank you, Taylor, for stopping by and joining us on The Communicative Leader. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I know our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much.
All right, my friends, that wraps up our conversation today. Until next time, communicate with intention and lead with purpose. I'm looking forward to chatting with you again soon on The Communicative Leader.